Good afternoon. My name is Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. And I'd like to thank everybody for showing up today and attending our book talk with Mr. Craig Whitlock, author of the Afghanistan Papers. It's very exciting to have him in here today. And if anybody was in attendance of our mess night last Thursday, this is a good 1-2 punch covering the topic of Afghanistan, as we had Mr. Christopher Kalenda in here to speak with us last Thursday night. Before we get started, I just want to say a very special thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support and all of our free virtual programming that we've been doing since COVID began. COVID is almost over now, but we're still doing our virtual programming. This is something that we are not going to end. It's something that's serving us and our audience very well. So thank you again to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support, as well as their sponsor, Generac Power Systems. Without those two organizations, we would not be able to continue with this free virtual programming. Just a quick reminder as well to all of our audience members that we do have our security features enabled today, so you'll not be able to unmute yourselves or start your video. So if you have any questions for our author, please send them to me via chat. Once again, I'll be populating a PowerPoint and bringing that up at the end with all of our questions. Today's author is Mr. Craig Whitlock. He's an American journalist who works for the Washington Post, where he's responsible for covering the Pentagon and national security. And in 2021, he published his first book, The Afghanistan Papers, which is what he's going to be speaking about with us today. Looking very much forward to it. Craig, thank you for joining us today.
You bet. Thanks, Eric. And thanks to the Veterans Museum for hosting me for this book talk. The book, The Afghanistan Papers, came out 1 year ago, just as the United States was completing its troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so I think the timing was pretty good back then. It's also relevant today because it's been 1 year since the evacuation from Afghanistan. People are, I think, still trying to wrestle with the very basic question of what went wrong in Afghanistan. How could the United States lose the longest war in American history to the Taliban, kind of a Stone Age group that was sort of the polar opposite of the most powerful military in the world. How could that happen? How did that unfold over 20 years? And, I think this point was really driven home a year ago when people saw on television the Taliban taking over in Kabul while the United States was sort of hanging on at the airport, trying to evacuate thousands of Afghans, hundreds of Americans. It sort of came into very sharp relief that tragically and unfortunately the United States had lost this war to the Taliban. I think people are still trying to come to terms with that and answer that question, why? And the way I got started on this book is I had been, as Eric pointed out, I was a beat reporter on the Pentagon beat for the Washington Post from 2010 to 2016. Before that, I'd been a foreign correspondent. So I'd spent a fair bit of time in Afghanistan going back and forth covering the war, covering counterterrorism operations. But by 2016, this was the end of President Obama's second term in office. People had really stopped paying attention to what was going on in Afghanistan for the most part. This was kind of a forgotten war, and in large part because we didn't have as many troops there, but also because US officials, particularly in the Obama administration, had repeatedly told the public that the war was over. People may remember that almost 8 years ago now, in December of 2014, there was a ceremony held in Kabul where US forces in Afghanistan and our NATO partners announced an end to the combat mission in Afghanistan. And President Obama himself had said, the war in Afghanistan is drawing to a responsible conclusion. So President Obama had promised to withdraw all US troops by the end of his second term in office. So people really stopped paying attention, in large part because the United States government had essentially told the public that the war was all but over. Of course, President Obama did not keep his campaign promise. He kept troops in Afghanistan because there were real fears that the Taliban was continuing to make progress and would take control of Afghanistan, that the government we had been propping up in Kabul wouldn't be able to hang on. President Trump also promised to bring home troops. He left a few thousand there when he left office. So this was a problem that US presidents had been, they wanted to get out, but they couldn't quite bring themselves to do it. So in the summer of 2016, one reason I started looking into this project was because of a well-known general at the time named Michael Flynn. He's more famous now for his political stances, for his controversial take on politics. I'm not a politics reporter, but back in 2016, you might recall that General Michael Flynn was a recently retired Army general who was becoming very outspoken in his support of Donald Trump. He appeared and spoke at the 2016 Republican National Convention. People may recall how he led the crowd in chants of lock her up about Hillary Clinton. But the reason I was curious to hear more about Flynn is I got a tip back in the summer of 2016 that General Flynn had given a long interview about the war in Afghanistan to a little known federal agency. This agency was called the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. And it's an inspector general whose mission it was to monitor fraud, waste, and abuse with all the spending in the war zone, all the defense contracts and other billions of dollars we were spending in Afghanistan. So I thought this was interesting. Well, why would Flynn give a long interview to the inspector general? But regardless, it was clear at that point that if Trump became president, that Flynn would take a very prominent role in his administration. And, as it turned out, he did. He became the national security advisor, the top national security official at the White House. So I wanted to find out what he had said in this interview, because when I had covered the Pentagon and the military, General Flynn, when he was in uniform, was known for being pretty blunt spoken, that he didn't hold back in his assessments of how things were going. He had a background in military intelligence. So I went to the Inspector General's office and asked him straight out, said, I'd like to I understand that General Flynn gave this interview. I'd like to see what he said. I understand there's a transcript of it. Can I have a copy? That it was an unclassified interview that General Flynn had given after he retired. And certainly his views on the war in Afghanistan would be possibly noteworthy. And at first, the Inspector General's office said, sure, that shouldn't be a problem. Give us a few days. And then a couple weeks later, he said, well, it still should be fine, but we need you to just sort of go through the process and file a Freedom of Information Act request for it. So, I did, and waited a few more weeks, and they kept saying they would get to it, they would release it. And then when Trump won election in November of 2016 and announced Flynn as his national security advisor, the very next day, the Inspector General's office finally got back to me and they denied my Freedom of Information Act request. They said I wasn't entitled to see a copy of this transcript of this interview with General Flynn. They didn't really give a good reason, they just denied it. Around that same time, I had heard that the Inspector General had actually interviewed many other people, hundreds of other people, more than 400 other people who had played some kind of role in the war in Afghanistan, dating back to the very beginning in 2001. The Inspector General had started a sort of side project in addition to their mission to root out fraud, waste, and abuse. They had a program that they called Lessons Learned, where they were trying to figure out what went wrong in Afghanistan so the US government wouldn't repeat those mistakes in any future conflicts. And again, at this time in 2016, people assumed the war was coming to an end. There were a few troops there. Obama had promised to get out. Trump also wanted to get out. So people assumed the war was coming to an end. So I thought, well, this is a perfect time to sort of answer this question of, what happened in Afghanistan, what went wrong. And so the Washington Post decided that it was very much in the public interest to find out not just what General Flynn said, but these hundreds of other people have been interviewed about the war. And these were people from White House officials to commanding generals in the field, to NATO officials, Afghan leaders, aid workers, grunts who served in Afghanistan, you name it. There were over 400 interviews. So the long and short of it, the Washington Post filed 2 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits in federal court against the Inspector General, arguing that these documents, these notes and transcripts and recordings of these interviews were very much in the public interest. This was money the public had spent, taxpayer dollars, to conduct these interviews. They were not classified, they were unclassified. So why couldn't the public see what these people had said? It took the Post 3 years in federal court to pry all these records loose. I finally obtained about 2,000 pages of documents. And most of them were pretty shocking. I'll read you some of them and show you what they look like. This is transcript of General Flynn's interview. It's about 10 pages. The blacked out parts are stuff that was redacted because they claimed it was too sensitive. But these are just transcripts of these interviews. Here's what he said when he was asked about what had gone wrong in Afghanistan. And he said, "To me, this is a really important point. If you go back and look at the mission statements for every battalion and every brigade from the beginning of the war, they are essentially all the same. It is defeat and destroy the enemy and protect the population. That was the mission for every battalion commander and every brigade commander from the US side. It was those two same things, defeat the enemy and protect the population. So all these commanders went in for whatever their rotation was, 9 months or 6 months, and were given that mission. They accepted that mission and executed that mission. Then they all said when they left Afghanistan, they all said they accomplished that mission. Every single commander. Not one commander is going to leave Afghanistan or Iraq or any place. Not one of them is going to leave and say, you know what, we didn't accomplish our mission. So the next guy that comes in that takes over command, he finds it all screwed up. And he goes, oh my God, this is really bad. And this is the cycle that repeated itself from 2002 till today. So that was a pretty unvarnished assessment. Flynn is essentially saying that all these commanders said they succeeded at their mission in Afghanistan. They go in for 6 or 9 or 12 months and they come out and said, I did it. You know, completed my mission, my unit, we're winning the war. And yet he said every time the new group would come in, they'd say, man, this is screwed up. Well, this is completely at odds with public statements that US commanders, Pentagon officials, and White House officials have been saying since the start of the war. Here you have, General Flynn, regardless of what you think of his politics, he had been in charge of NATO and US military intelligence in Afghanistan at the height of the surge. So this is a pretty revealing interview, and I was glad that we fought for it. But it wasn't just Flynn. We got interview after interview from US leaders describing in really raw terms just how screwed up things in Afghanistan were. One of the most prominent ones was an interview with another general, retired General Douglas Lute. He was a 3-star general in the Army who served as the war czar under Bush and Obama at the White House. So he was the Deputy National Security Advisor for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan under 2 presidents from both parties for several years. And here's what General Lute said about Afghanistan. He said, I'm reading again from this transcript of his interview, I bumped into an even more fundamental lack of knowledge. We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. What are we trying to do here? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. And he goes on and on for several pages to talk about all the money that was wasted, how they didn't have a strategy, they really didn't have an effective plan. Then he finally said this, he said, if the American people knew the magnitude of this dysfunction, 2,400 lives lost, who will say this was in vain? Well, I've been covering the military for several years, and to hear a 3-star general even suggest that, he said 2,400 lives lost. Who will say this was in vain? He's referring, of course, to the 2,400 US troops who died serving their country in Afghanistan. He's questioning whether it was in vain. You never hear generals of that rank questioning whether this sacrifice was worth it. He's saying, he's at least raising the question that this had been a doomed mission, that it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth this sacrifice. And that was personally shocking to me that he would be so forthright. But again, sometimes you sit back and you think, well, maybe he's venting, maybe he's frustrated, maybe he's blowing off some steam, who knows, maybe he had a bad day. But we started getting day by day more transcripts, more documents in response to our federal public records lawsuit. Let me read you another one. This is from a diplomat, Ambassador Richard Boucher. He was the top diplomat for South Asia during the Bush administration. He was also the chief Pentagon spokesman for a number of years. He was a career diplomat, so he's not a political appointee. This is the very start of his interview, his transcript. He says, "Let me approach this from two directions. The first question of, did we know what we were doing? The second question is, what was wrong with how we did it? The first question of, did we know what we were doing? I think the answer is no." So again, just like General Ludi saying we didn't know what we were doing. He said, first we went in to get Al-Qaeda and to get Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. And even without killing bin Laden, we did that. The Taliban was shooting back at us, so we started shooting at them and they became the enemy. Ultimately, we kept expanding the mission. If there was ever a notion of mission creep, it is Afghanistan. We went from saying we will get rid of Al-Qaeda so they can't threaten us anymore to saying we were going to end the Taliban. Then we said we will get all of the groups the Taliban works with. And he goes on about how we didn't have an exit strategy because accomplishing all those mission creep goals was impossible. And he repeated this phrase again. He said, we did not know what we were doing. He said, I think the idea that we went in with was that this Afghanistan was going to become like a US state or something. And that's what condemned us to 15 years of war instead of 2 or 3. So again, a top diplomat for Afghanistan saying we didn't know what we were doing. Here's another interview. This is with a field command, a commanding general in Afghanistan. He's actually a British general, David Richards. He was in charge of US and NATO troops in Afghanistan from 2006 to 2007. Here's what he said. He said, no long-term strategy, no command and control. We were trying to get a single coherent long-term approach, a proper strategy. But instead, we got a lot of tactics. There was no coherent long-term strategy. And he goes and tells this story. In 2006, Donald Rumsfeld, the defense secretary at the time, came to Afghanistan on a visit. And General Richards said, Donald Rumsfeld asked me why things were deteriorating in the South. And I said, we don't have enough resources. And Rummy said, General, what do you mean? I said, we don't have enough troops and resources, and we've raised expectations. We didn't have a strategy. We didn't have a coherent strategy. Here's the commanding general of all US and NATO forces admitting there was no coherent strategy. He didn't say we had a bad strategy or a flawed strategy or one that in retrospect just was the wrong, didn't make sense. He just said we didn't have one. And when the defense secretary of the United States comes in to say what's going wrong, and the general says we need more troops, we need more resources, Rumsfeld blows him, tells him very directly, he said, I don't agree, move on, take care of the problem. So that's a very revealing window, and it's how screwed up things were back in 2006. Again, I thought, well, maybe General Richards is being frustrated, maybe he's venting in hindsight, but here's another interview with his successor as the commanding general of all US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. This is a general named Dan McNeil. He was an Army general, four-star Army general who twice commanded all US troops in Afghanistan during the Bush administration. Here's what he says. He says, in 2000, there was no NATO campaign plan. A lot of verbiage and talk, but no plan. So for better or worse, a lot of what we did, most of it was reacting to conditions on the ground. We were opportunists. There was no campaign plan. There were people who thought it existed and they were taking care of their piece of it, but it didn't exist. He goes on, General McNeil goes on to say, I tried to get someone to define for me what winning meant, even before I went over, and nobody could. Some people were thinking in terms of Jeffersonian democracy, but that's just not going to happen in Afghanistan. So here again, commanding general of all US and NATO forces saying, before he went over in 2007 to take command, he's trying to get people in Brussels and Washington at the highest levels of government and of the alliance to say, how do you define winning in this war? What are our objectives? And he said, nobody could. That's, again, this is completely contrary to what the American people were being told by our leaders throughout the war. You have two commanding generals, war czar at the White House, General Flynn, top diplomat, all saying, we didn't know what we were doing in Afghanistan. We didn't have a strategy. That's shocking to me. I mean, I'm not a cynical reporter. I'm somebody who sticks to the facts, doesn't try to get into politics, but the raw admissions of how bad things were in Afghanistan all that time, it was shocking to read it in black and white. And again, these are unclassified interviews, but they're on the record with their names attached. So I knew we had a big story here. The question was, how do we present this? How do we keep going? Well, one other source of documentation I was able to get my hands on were a number of memos that Donald Rumsfeld had written as the defense secretary during the Bush administration. Rumsfeld was known for dictating memos, kind of old-fashioned, and they look like this. A lot of times they were one-page memos that he'd dictate to a secretary, and at the Pentagon they called them snowflakes. The reason they called them snowflakes is Rumsfeld would dictate so many of these memos that they would print out the paper and they would float down on people's desks and pile up in a big drift of paper. And so they referred to them as snowflakes because they'd have to respond. And Rumsfeld would, write or dictate, one or a few dozen a day. He didn't send emails, he sent snowflakes. Well, these snowflakes, it turned out, were public record. And a group in Washington called the National Security Archive, which is a nonprofit research foundation based at George Washington University. They had sued the Defense Department under the Freedom of Information Act to obtain all of Rumsfeld's declassified snowflake memos. And there were so many of these, I think there were like 50,000 that he, during his archive, had just won their federal lawsuit, their public records lawsuit, and they had so many of these snowflakes. It was all about everything that was going on in the Defense Department, but they agreed to share them with me, the ones about Afghanistan. So I was thrilled to take a look. And again, what you would see, what Rumsfeld would write in his snowflakes compared to what he would say in public were two different things entirely. Let me tell you a story. So back in April of 2002, President George Bush made a trip to the Virginia Military Institute in Southwestern Virginia, give a speech about the war in Afghanistan. It had been 6 months since US troops had gone to Afghanistan. The Taliban had been removed from power. Al-Qaeda's leaders were either killed, captured, or had fled Afghanistan, like Osama bin Laden. So really, there was very little fighting going on. There was very little of the enemy left. And so the American people felt pretty good about it. And President Bush tries to reassure the American people that things are going well. And there are some questions already building at that point in April 2002 about, well, are you going to get mired in Afghanistan? Is it going to turn into a quagmire like what happened to the Soviets during the 1980s? And Bush tried to reassure the American people. He said, no, we will not squander our sacrifice in Afghanistan. He says, we will not suffer the same fate in Afghanistan as the British or the Soviets. And he said in this televised speech at the Virginia Military Academy, their experiences have been one of initial success, followed by long years of floundering and ultimate failure. We're not going to repeat that mistake. So here's Bush saying, we've learned the lessons of history of what happened to other great powers in Afghanistan. We're not going to do what the British or the Soviets did. We're not going to get bogged down. It's not going to turn into a quagmire. Don't worry. Well, on that same day, that same morning, Donald Rumsfeld was at the Pentagon, and he dictates this snowflake memo to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and two of his top civilian aides, Doug Feith and Paul Wolfowitz. And it's a one-page memo from Rumsfeld. Subject, Afghanistan. I may be impatient. I'm a bit impatient. But the fact that Iran and money months to figure it out. And he ends the memo by saying, we are never going to get the US military out of Afghanistan unless we take care to see that there is something going on that will provide the stability that will be necessary for us to leave. And he ends the memo, you can't see it here, but he ends it with one word, help, exclamation point. So here you have, think about this for a minute. In April 2002, 6 months into the war, you have the President of the United States going on television, telling the public that, don't worry, we're not going to get stuck in Afghanistan. We're not going to repeat the mistakes of the Brits and the Soviets there. We've learned our lessons from history. That same day, Donald Rumsfeld, his defense secretary, writes a confidential memo to his top staff at the Pentagon, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and says, we're never going to get the US military Afghanistan unless we come up with a plan. And he ends it by saying help. So here you complete total opposite, right? Message for the public, everything's good. In private, Rumsfeld's already freaking out. Oh my God, we're going to get stuck. This really sums up the war in Afghanistan. And I knew by this point that we had a really important story to tell the American people. But how do we do it? How do we do it in an effective way? This is a war that people haven't been paying much attention to, but how do we say this in a forthright, strong, effective, powerful way that for years, people in Afghanistan who were running the war knew things weren't going well, but they kept telling the public that everything was good. So in December of 2019, 3 years after I started reporting on this, 3 years after we first started trying to get our hands on these transcripts and records, the Washington Post published a 5-part series called the Afghanistan Papers. And it was a direct allusion to the Pentagon Papers that were published during the Vietnam War, which showed that, again, the American public was told that things were going well in Vietnam, even though its leaders in the field and at the White House knew that that wasn't the case. I'm just going to read you the first couple of sentences from the top of our lead story. The headline was, "At War with the Truth." And this is the lead paragraph. A confidential trove of government documents obtained by the Washington Post reveals that senior US officials failed to tell the truth about the war in Afghanistan throughout the 18-year campaign, making rosy pronouncements they knew to be false and hiding unmistakable evidence that the war had become unwinnable. US officials constantly said they were making progress. They were not, and they knew it. That's a pretty strong, straightforward lead, but we had it backed up with evidence. We published 2,000 pages of documents online. We paired them with the quotations throughout our articles so people could see that these weren't blind sources or anonymous sources. This was documents of people saying things on the record, and we were able to match them up with all the quotations in the story. In some cases, we had recordings of people like General Flynn giving their interviews. This created a bit of a sensation. I was shocked at the time. I was worried that people wouldn't pay any attention to our stories because this was in the middle of the first impeachment of Donald Trump. And in the United States, people pay a lot of attention to politics, but not so much to what's going on overseas, particularly after 20 years of war. So I was actually very heartened when this turned into the most read project in Washington Post coverage that year. This got a ton of attention because I think people knew all along, they suspected the government hadn't been telling them the truth about what had been going on in Afghanistan. And here it was in black and white, hard proof that that was true, that they hadn't been told the truth, that they had been gaslighted about what was going on in Afghanistan. But still, this was, again, I'll take you back, this is December 2019. We still had several thousand troops in Afghanistan. Still, most of our leadership at the Pentagon and the White House and the State Department were telling the American people that things were going according to plan, that there was no danger that we would lose this war to the Taliban. So while the series created a lot of debate and got a lot of attention, there were still people in denial, saying that things were going well in Afghanistan, that our reporting overstated things. Well, we decided to write a book about this. We decided it was really important to dig deeper, that we wanted to tell people in a nutshell what went wrong in Afghanistan. And we wanted to do it all with documents. We wanted to do it all with public documents that the government had tried to withhold from the American people to show them what they were really saying. And in addition to all those interviews we obtained from the Special Inspector General, I was able to get my hands on a number of other primary source documents. One was a real trove of oral history interviews that the US Army had been conducting at Fort Leavenworth with people who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq, essentially any mid-level officers who had served in what they called the Global War on Terror, when they would cycle back through the United States and they would come for a professional military education course at Fort Leavenworth. They would pull them aside for an oral history interview. And there were a few hundred of these of people who served in Afghanistan. And they were terrific. They were unclassified, on the record, but had never really been made public before. In addition, I was able to get another set of oral history interviews that had just been released to the public in late 2019 by the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. The Miller Center conducts presidential oral history projects with all our modern presidential administrations, and they had spent years interviewing more than 100 officials who had served in George W. Bush's administration, and they just started releasing those in December of 2019. And this had to do with every subject imaginable during the Bush years, but I was able to pull aside the ones that had to do with Afghanistan. On top of that, we're also able to obtain really helpful oral history interviews that another group affiliated with the State Department had done with diplomats. So the end result was, a year later, in August of 2021, we published the Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War. This was a much more expanded, thorough version of the series we had originally published in the Washington Post. It was all chronological. Or other documents that people have been very frank and forthright about what had went wrong. And I just want to explain a little bit as a journalist, the difference here in terms of the veracity and honesty these people have said in these interviews. In most cases, these people have talked to historians or to people from the Inspector General's office, and they were assured that the remarks wouldn't be made public or would be held for years. So frankly, they kind of unburden themselves. People were very forthright. They spoke very honestly because they thought maybe their names wouldn't be attached to it, or by the time that they were made public, they'd be gone or they wouldn't have to worry about it. They didn't anticipate that the Washington Post would get their hands on it. Again, I want to emphasize, it was our argument, these are all public records. Taxpayers had paid for it, the University of Virginia, the Army had done these interviews. There was a real public interest in them. But the difference, if I had gone to these people as a journalist for the Washington Post and sat down with them and said, okay, let's talk about Afghanistan, they might have talked to me, but they would have been very guarded. They would have been very careful. They would have been very hesitant to criticize commanders in the field or presidents they worked for. They would have held back. That's almost human nature. Nobody would want to say the real truth. The difference in this book is, this is the real truth about what people thought, and they didn't think it was going to be made public. So for once, they were honest about how screwed things up were in Afghanistan. I want to give you some examples of how things were so different from what people said in private and what they were saying in public throughout the 20 years of the war. Back in September of 2006, so this goes back 5 years into the war, on the 5-year anniversary of September 11th, the US commanding general at the time, a guy named Carl Eikenberry, a 3-star Army general, gave an interview to ABC News on the 5th anniversary of 9/11. And he was asked, of course, how are things going in Afghanistan? And truthfully, things weren't going very well. People knew the Taliban was starting to make a comeback. There were a lot of suicide bombings in Kabul. They hadn't taken over by a long shot, but it was clear the war wasn't going well. But General Eikenberry says to ABC News, he goes, quote, "We are winning. Losing is not an option in Afghanistan." And he keeps talking about this multitude of good news in Afghanistan. Well, again, in private, one thing I obtained for the book was a diplomatic cable. It had been classified at the time, was later declassified. It was written by US Ambassador at the time, Ronald Newman. He sent it back to the Pentagon and the State Department in the White House. And in this cable, the headline says, "We are not winning in Afghanistan." So again, here in public, you have a three-star general saying, we are winning. In private, the ambassador saying, we are not winning. So it's this total contradiction in what people are saying in public, what they're saying in private. At the same time, it wasn't just the ambassador who said we're not winning. There was another classified document, later declassified, that was written by a guy named Marin Stromecki. He was a top civilian advisor to Rumsfeld on Afghanistan. He was considered an expert in Afghanistan. He had gone to Afghanistan in the summer of 2006 to kind of do a survey, a fact-finding mission of how things were going. And he sent a long memo back to Afghanistan saying, you know, the Taliban is strong, the Afghan government is weak, and things are going in the wrong direction. Similarly, there was another report, a fact-finding mission carried out by a retired general named Barry McCaffrey. He had gone to Afghanistan to interview people for Rumsfeld, and he also came back and said, the war is deteriorating, the Afghan government's a mess, and he said what was particularly hopeless was the state of the Afghan security forces, the Afghan army and the Afghan police. He said, you know, our training program is going nowhere, these forces are terrible, they can barely fight the Taliban without our help. And he essentially said this might take another 15 or 20 years to sort it out. We need to change our approach. So again, in private, these documents are showing things are a real mess as far back as 2006, yet in public, everybody's saying how good things are. I'll give you another example. In February 2007, Vice President Dick Cheney made a visit to Afghanistan. It was unannounced. He shows up at the US military base at Bagram, which is about an hour north drive of Kabul. And at the time, there was, while he was at Bagram Air Base, there was a Taliban suicide bomber who blew himself up outside the front gate of Bagram Air Base. And immediately, the Taliban put out a statement saying that the suicide bomber had tried to kill Dick Cheney, that they knew he was there. And immediately afterward, the US military puts out a statement from Afghanistan saying, the Taliban's making this all up. This is just propaganda. They claim that, you know, nobody, you know, Cheney's visit hadn't been announced. The Taliban didn't know he was there. They just, you know, it was totally unconnected. The vice president was never in danger. The Taliban's making this all up. Now, the reason the timing of this is important is 2007, the war is clearly not going well. The Taliban isn't as strong as they're going to become, but by that point, they had spread their influence from their base in the mountains in the east and from the south. And they were actually starting to carry out attacks in Kabul and north of it. And the fact that they could have a suicide bomber blow himself up at the front gate of the biggest US base in Afghanistan was big news. And it was even bigger news, the fact that the vice president was there. But again, in public, the US military is saying, you know, just saying, no, this is, the vice president was never in danger. Taliban had no idea the vice president was there. They're just, you know, they're making a lot out of nothing. Well, in an Army oral history interview that I obtained that was done at Fort Leavenworth with an Army officer at the time was a captain, a guy named Sean Dalrymple. He was a guy with the 82nd Airborne who was actually in charge of base and perimeter security at Bagram Air Base. And he was there on that day. And in fact, his job that day was to help the Secret Service protect Vice President Cheney. And Captain Dalrymple gives this long oral history interview where he recounts that actually the Taliban knew that Cheney was there. They'd found out through their intelligence network, and that they actually had become maybe 30 minutes from blowing up Dick Cheney as he was scheduled to leave the base. They said that, this captain said that the Taliban suicide bomber blew himself up at the front gate because he saw some SUVs with, you know, dark windows coming out of the front gate. And, you know, in Afghanistan, you know, that's a VIP escort, right? When you see these vehicles come out. So the guy blew himself up, but it turned out it was the wrong VIP. It wasn't Cheney. Cheney was supposed to come out 30 minutes later. So it was really close. And he says there was no doubt, we were worried that Cheney was in danger even before that they had a plan with the Secret Service that they were going to disguise Cheney. Instead of putting him in the black SUV, they were going to put him in the gun truck so that the Taliban, if they blew up a vehicle, they'd go after the wrong one. So again, the importance of this story is in public, the US military is downplaying how the threats to the war, downplaying the strength of the Taliban, and flat out lying when they said that the Taliban didn't know Dick Cheney was at Bagram Air Base. And yet the officer in charge of base security gives a completely different story, says actually the Taliban was right on. It was US military that was, feeding a load of hooey to the American public about how things were going. And I dwell on this story because you hear it again and again through the interviews and documents we obtained. They would say one thing in public, another thing in private. And again, not to be, some people are cynical and say, well, government's always like that. I would argue that's not the case. But one of the questions is, why? Why didn't people tell the truth? Why didn't our leaders in the field, our commanding officers, or people at the Pentagon or the State Department, why didn't they tell the truth about how things are going? Why did people bite their tongues? And I'll give you one example. Toward the beginning of the Obama administration in spring of 2009, the commanding general at the time in Afghanistan was a guy named General David McKiernan. He was an Army general. And one day, out of the blue, the Defense Secretary, Robert Gates, came into the Pentagon briefing room to give a press conference. This press conference had been unannounced. The reporters had just been told about it maybe an hour beforehand. So they didn't know why Gates was coming in to give a press conference. Gates comes in and he just very matter-of-factly announces that he's relieved the commanding general in Afghanistan of duty, so that General McKiernan has been fired. And this is really unusual, right? I mean, how often do commanding generals in a war zone get fired? Well, I'll tell you, it almost never happens. The previous time for this to happen was during the Korean War, when President Truman fired General MacArthur for his handling of the Korean War, which was a huge incident in our nation's history. So fast forward some 50, 60 years, that happens again in Afghanistan. It's a big moment. But when reporters ask Gates, well, what did he do wrong? What did General McKiernan do? This must have been some big scandal, or, what did he do that would merit getting fired? We've been told all along that things are going well in Afghanistan. And Gates gave this very curious answer, no, he didn't do anything wrong. He did everything what he was supposed to do. We just thought we needed a new thinking at the top. We needed new leadership. It was very strange. It didn't add up because Gates had actually put McKiernan in charge just 9 months before. One clue is that General McKiernan had actually, unlike his predecessors, been a little more forthright that things weren't going well in Afghanistan. Soon after he took command, he actually questioned whether things were going in the right direction. He admitted that the Taliban was gaining strength. He constantly said that he needed more troops in Afghanistan. So, he wasn't being Pollyanna-ish, but he was admitting things weren't going well in the war. Well, in the documents I obtained for the book, there was an oral history interview with a couple officers who had worked for General McKiernan in Afghanistan. And they recounted this story about how a few days before McKiernan had been fired, that he had come to them and admitted that he was in trouble with his superiors back at the Pentagon. And he was a little cagey about what had happened, but he said, I think we did too good of a job of saying how bad things are over here. And so regardless of whether or why Gates fired McKiernan, there was a clear message that was being sent, which was, don't say things aren't going well. Don't say we're not winning in Afghanistan. You have to stick to the talking points in public that we're making progress, that victory's around the corner, that the Taliban can't win. So that message was sent loud and clear back in 2009 by the unusual step of firing the war commander in Afghanistan. And so, as a lot of you in the military know, that people they learn a lesson from that. They're not going to contradict their boss at the top, whether it's at the White House or the Pentagon. So really for the next 10 years, all of McKiernan's successors said the same thing. They would talk about how in public, yes, there are challenges in Afghanistan, but we're making progress, that we have the right strategy, that victory's around the corner, we just need more time, or we need this or that. And really things stayed with that public statement until the very end in August of last year, when people could see with their own eyes how the United States very quickly had to evacuate tens of thousands of Afghans, many Americans, and it was clear that the Taliban, there was no question that they had won the war. They occupied Kabul. The Afghan government had fled. The Afghan security forces had folded very quickly over a few months. So all these, all this talk about how we were making progress, it was clear it wasn't true. And that was one thing I was just proud about this book, because I think American people want to know, how did that happen? What went wrong? And I think this book, as much as any, explains what happened with the failed strategies, failed plans, and above all, the lies that were told the American people over 20 years. It lays it all out, not in Craig Whitlock's opinion, but these are from documents in black and white from the people themselves who were in charge of the war and people who served on the front lines. And so I hope it goes to some extent to explain to the American people just what did go wrong in Afghanistan. Because I think this is going to be something we're going to be wrestling with for years, for generations, just like we did after Vietnam. We still have debates over what happened there, what went wrong. And unfortunately, I think that's going to keep happening in Afghanistan for decades to come. So with that, I'll shut up and be happy to take questions. Eric, if you have any to shoot my way, I'm happy to take them, but thanks very much for hearing me out.
Oh, we have several, Craig, several. And we did have a couple that came in late. I did not get them out of the PowerPoint, so I'll start with those ones. And first of all, how did the reality on the ground, i.e. that we're clearly not winning this war, how did that influence events during the final months, or our final months there?
I'm sorry, was that, how did that what during the last final months?
How did that mentality that we were holding on to for so long, how did that influence our last few months there?
Well, that's a really good question. So I think, again, there was this contradiction. I think a lot of the troops who served on the front lines, they knew things weren't going well, right? A lot of the oral history interviews we obtained with people who were mid-level or junior officers or enlisted folks, they knew from their time in Afghanistan, whether they were training Afghan forces, Afghan soldiers, Afghan police, or they were liaisons to Afghan ministries, they knew that corruption was a terrible problem. They knew that the Afghan security forces, despite these billions of dollars we spent training and equipping and paying their salaries, they just didn't have any faith that they were going to be able to hold off the Taliban. So the people on the front lines knew, but I think that message, had been sent up the chain of command, but people at the top either didn't want to hear it or didn't want to deal with it, or were afraid it would affect their careers if they told the truth. So I think people knew this was coming, but they just hadn't told the public. That said, I do believe that even in the last days of our presence in Afghanistan, the United States fundamentally still was ignorant about Afghanistan as a country. We didn't understand Afghanistan culture, politics, religion, tribal relationships. We'd spent 20 years there, but we had hardly anybody who could speak the language. Most people went in for 6 or 9 months at a time. By the time they kind of got up to speed, they came home. So we kept sending in new people, and we really never gained a really good understanding of what made Afghanistan tick. So we made a lot of assumptions that turned out to be false. And people might remember that even in the summer of 2021, people in our leaders, President Biden and others, intelligence agencies started putting out reports saying, well, we know, the Taliban could take over in a few months, but we think the Afghan government can hold them off for a few months after we leave, right? This was the whole drawdown was predicated on this idea that the Afghan government would be able to hold off the Taliban till months after the US pulled out. Well, that didn't happen, right? So the Taliban very quickly swept through a lot of the provincial capitals. So I think even at the end, our intelligence agencies really, we didn't understand Afghanistan. We didn't see things going on right in front of our eyes. And this gets back to the interviews, the lessons learned interviews with General Lute and with Ambassador Boucher. We said we didn't know what we were doing. We lacked a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. I think that was true through the end.
My video is, there we go. I'm going to move on to the slides if you don't mind. If you give me just a second here, start my screen share. Craig, the first question, Why do you think that the previous administrations, going all the way back to Bush, why do you think they disregarded the military's input?
I think, I'm not sure I agree with the assumption there. I think a lot of times there was this tension between the civilian administrations and what the military was saying, but I think Rumsfeld actually, he kind of put his stamp on the strategy in Afghanistan during the Bush years. Frankly, the strategy during the Bush years was affected most profoundly by our decision to invade in Iraq. So people took their eyes off the ball in Afghanistan. And in a time when we probably could have done a lot more to stabilize the country and bring in a stronger government, we kind of missed that opportunity during the period between 2003 and 2005 because we were so focused on Iraq. So I'm not sure at that point it was that disregarding the military's input, except commanders in Afghanistan saying, we need more troops, I need more resources. And well, they had all been sent to Iraq. During the Obama years, I think actually the military commanders and senior officials at the Pentagon, they were the ones who sold Obama on this idea of a highly resourced counterinsurgency strategy that they pushed to send 100,000 US troops to Afghanistan to spend a lot more. And so there was tension there because Obama was worried the United States was trying to bite off more than it could, that this wouldn't work. So he had put this, he essentially said, okay, I'll send more troops there, but we're not going to stay forever. I'm going to start withdrawing within 18 months. So Obama accepted some of their advice, but not all of it. And this happens in wartime all the time. You get people in uniform saying one thing, that's why we're a civilian government, they're the ones who call the shots. So I don't know that they disregarded it. I would say none of them were right. You look back at our strategies in Afghanistan, it wasn't like one group knew what it was doing and was overridden by the other. Nobody really knew what they were doing. During the first several years of the war, we took our eye off the ball. And then this surge strategy under Obama was well-intentioned, but that the Afghan government was weak and corrupt, and that no matter what we did to build them up, that their own people saw the Afghan government as corrupt, and that as much as they disliked or detested the Taliban, many Afghans, particularly in rural areas, saw the Taliban as preferable to the Afghan government. Yet we were the foreign forces trying to prop up this government in Kabul, and we could never make that work. There were many, many other problems, and I think by that time, really no president wanted to be seen as losing the war in Afghanistan for obvious reasons. Take you back to 2001, when we sent troops to Afghanistan in October 2001, President Bush announced we were taking military action there. Public opinion polls showed that the vast, vast majority of the American people supported this war. It was very different from Iraq and Vietnam. People understood why we were going to Afghanistan. It was to prevent a repeat of 9/11 and to eliminate the Al-Qaeda as a threat. That was a very clear strategy and objective. People understood that. They supported the war. They supported the idea of sending troops there. The problem was, as I mentioned in that one interview with Ambassador Boucher, mission creep set in. And within 6 months, we went from fighting the Al-Qaeda to, well, why are we there? What are we trying to accomplish? And the goals became much more fuzzy. But after that point, people thought we had won the war in Afghanistan. Back in early 2002, we thought we had won. What president or what commanding general after that point wants to go down in history as a person who lost this war that the whole public had been behind? And I think there was just this real reluctance to admit the war had become unwinnable. So each president kept kicking the problem down to the next guy. And I think that's what we saw happen at the end.
Craig, what do you think led to the compartmentalization of views from both our civilian and our military leaders?
Well, I'll give you a good example. There was an oral history interview with a retired Army colonel who served at headquarters in Kabul, and he said, it's a typical problem in the military that, bad news doesn't travel up the chain of command very well. People didn't want to hear when people had doubts, right? They wanted to hear progress. They wanted to see evidence that things were going the right direction. They wanted to report all the way up to the Pentagon and the White House that things were on track. So when people in the field are saying, well, this isn't going that well, that the Afghan forces, these guys can't shoot straight, really. And I'm not exaggerating. I saw interview after interview, people saying these guys literally couldn't shoot straight. There was one story of a guy in the army who had to take Afghan forces for remedial training in marksmanship, and he took a watermelon, put a stick in it, and stabbed it in the ground. And he said, "Okay, guys, shoot the watermelon." And the Afghan guys would, spray their AK-47s and would miss the watermelon. And then he'd bring in the U.S. Army sergeant, say, "Okay, show them how it's done." And the Army sergeant would take one shot and the watermelon would blow up. But I mean, it's just sort of in these incredible stories of how poorly, not just poorly trained, but poorly performing the Afghan forces were. But, in public, the senior officers, the generals, people at the Pentagon and at the White House, they had to tell the American people that the strategy of arming and equipping and training the Afghan security forces so they can take over their own security responsibilities, they had to say that strategy was working, even though people down the chain of the command kept sending up reports that it was a disaster. So I don't know if that's compartmentalization as much as people not wanting to hear the truth or not sure what to do with the truth. And I think that's the story that you see time and again through the military chain of command, but also the civilian one.
What do you think our mindset for years was regarding Al-Qaeda and Taliban being one and the same entity? Do you think that really hampered our performance over there, or at least maybe our planning?
Absolutely, no question. I think that the line blurred early on that our leaders, and whether it's civilian or military, that it was all the bad guys, right? And you'd see this again and again in these oral history interviews. The shocking thing to me is people in the field would say, they kept referring to the enemy as the bad guys, right? And understandably, the enemy doesn't wear uniforms over there. How do you single them out in Afghanistan? This is a place that most Americans aren't familiar with. So they just kept saying, "Where are the bad guys? Where are the bad guys?" And they had a hard time identifying the enemy in the field. But it was also from a strategic level, we didn't identify the enemy. We blurred this line between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and we forgot there were real important distinctions here. So just to review, Al-Qaeda was responsible for 9/11. The hijackers on 9/11 were all Arabs. 15 of them were Saudis, a few from the United Arab Emirates, but none of them were Afghans. None of them were Taliban. Now, Al-Qaeda's leadership was based in Afghanistan because the Taliban gave them refuge there. There's no question the two groups got along and were allied, but the Taliban had nothing to do with 9/11. It's also true that after 9/11, the Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden to the United States. President Bush had told the Taliban, "Look, we won't invade if you hand us bin Laden. Our fight isn't with and we weren't in a war with the Taliban at first." The Taliban refused, so the United States went in to go after Al-Qaeda, and in the end, the Taliban fled and were toppled from power. But from that point forward, we really blurred the line that the enemy, the bad guys, were both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. We didn't really distinguish. There was this hunt going on for bin Laden and other leaders, but we lost that definition. And here's why it mattered, because if we just stuck into a war against Al-Qaeda, we had pretty much won that war early on. Within 6 months. There was very little Al-Qaeda presence left in Afghanistan. But because we blurred the lines with the Taliban, we ended up getting stuck in this long-running Afghan civil war. We got in the middle of this fight that had been going on for years between the Taliban and other Afghan warlords and other factions. And this was something the United States really didn't understand very well. And by getting stuck in that, it became very difficult to get out of Afghanistan, or certainly to bring any stability there. And that was a fundamental failure of the war, no question, from the beginning.
Craig, what surprised you the most as you conducted your research?
Just the honesty people had in these interviews about how screwed up things were. The fact that we didn't know what we were doing in Afghanistan. I think the biggest thing was to read these interviews with commanding generals who admitted they didn't have a strategy. Again, I'm not a military historian, but I can't remember another war the United States has been involved in where a commanding general has said, we just didn't have a strategy, we're on autopilot. There's always some kind of strategy, right? It may be screwed up, maybe it didn't work well, some of them were real blunders, but these people are saying we just didn't have a strategy, particularly during the Bush years. And I think this gets back to that earlier question of, did we mash the Taliban and Al Qaeda together? So think about it, we didn't have a strategy, these people are saying in their own words. We couldn't tell who the enemy was. That was the other thing that really struck me reading oral histories with people on the front lines. I mean, they're going over there to serve their country. They deployed to Afghanistan, particularly in the years after 9/11. People saw this as a real noble mission, understandably. This was in defense of the United States. We had been attacked. It was unlike Iraq in that sense, unlike Vietnam. We had been attacked by Al Qaeda and their base was in Afghanistan. So these people were going there to put their lives on the line to serve our country. And yet they would get over there and they would say, who are the bad guys? Show me the bad guys. And their superiors couldn't do it. They had a hard time, identifying who the enemy was. So if you don't have a strategy and you can't identify the enemy, things are pretty screwed up. It's hard to see how that's going to turn out well. But yet, once you read these documents and you go back, it becomes clear that this is not going to end well. If you can't get those basic things right, and that even sets aside questions like, what are our strategic objectives? What exactly are we trying to accomplish here? How will we know that we've accomplished enough that we can go home? Nobody was ever able to articulate those points. So you add it all up, and in hindsight, it becomes clear why things failed. But at the time, I think the American public knew things weren't going well in Afghanistan, obviously. By definition, if you're stuck in a war for 20 years, it's not going very well. But to hear people say just how bad it was, that we didn't have a strategy, couldn't identify the enemy, we didn't know what the objectives were, it almost goes from being shocking to the people at the top were really derelict in bringing us into war there without a clear stated mission of what we were trying to do.
Are there any sources that you didn't get to include in your work that you wish you really had?
Yes, of course. As a reporter, you always want more, right? And even though I had hundreds of interviews, thousands of pages of transcripts, I mean, some really just incredible troves of information that hadn't been made public before, you always want more. And certainly some of the voices that I wish we had more of some interviews, aid workers and contractors there, but there weren't very many, and the quality of them wasn't that great. And that's certainly a voice that I wish we had more of in the book and in the story of what went wrong. Now, a lot of the Afghans who did give interviews, a number of them were pretty unsparing, and in particularly in this question of, they would say the Americans just didn't understand our country. There was one really telling interview, an aid worker, and I think it was in Logar province, he was talking about that. He said the Americans, they kept trying to spend all this money on building things up, and they would build up this bridge. There was this bridge in the province that the Americans would spend all this money trying to build it up, and the Taliban would keep blowing it up, and the Americans would go in and build it up again. And the Afghan guy told the story. He says, well, it was actually a racket because there was one Afghan guy who ran a reconstruction company, and he would get the contract to build the bridge, right? So he'd get rich building the bridge, and he had a cousin who was in the Taliban, and he'd get his cousin to blow it up so that he could get another contract to build it. So you had these two Afghan guys who were in the same tribe or family, and they I mean, you think about it, it's absurd, right? But this happened for years. The one guy would get American taxpayer money to build the bridge, and his cousin would blow it up so his cousin could get rich again. And it was just the story to me, it just illustrated we meant well in this country. We tried to do our best to build up their government, and yet we just had a fundamental ignorance of how life worked over there. And that was a real big problem. And I wish we had more voices like that available, not just for this book, but for researchers in general.
And now to kind of piggyback on that, since we're out of there, are you planning a second edition to this book with some updated information? Or should I not ask that question just yet?
No, it's actually okay. So actually, the paperback edition comes out next week. Generally, when you publish a book, there's a paperback comes out a year later. And so there is an epilogue, an afterword in the paperback edition that takes in the last several months of what happened during the evacuation and the drawdown. The original book, the hardback that came out a year ago, it was only current through May of 2021, when President Biden had announced in May 2021 that he was going to withdraw all US troops. At that point, he said by September 11th of 2021. Of course, it turned out to be a little sooner. So the original edition was missing those last few months. And the paperback edition has an afterword, an epilogue that folds that in. So one thing I'm proud of is this book, this new edition, will really cover the entirety of our involvement in Afghanistan. It's not a comprehensive history of Afghanistan. It's not a comprehensive military history. It doesn't tell you about all the military campaigns and battles and everything, but it is a history of what went wrong in Afghanistan, trying to explain that from beginning to end. And given that we were there for 20 years, it's harder than you think to tell that story, right? There have been a phenomenal number of books written about the war in Afghanistan, but most of them focus on individual battles or moments in time, or one presidential administration or another pivot points. There's only a few that really deal with what happened from 2001 to 2021, and this I'm proud of is one of the few that does that.
Yeah, it's really hard to compile and compress all that information into one source. We over here at the museum thought you've done a fantastic job of doing that.
Well, I appreciate that, and certainly one reassuring thing to me is hear from many people who've read it who served in Afghanistan, both in uniform and as civilians, and to hear them say that it rings true, that maybe they were there for a year, some of them did multiple tours, but they would say it rings true with their experiences. And maybe sometimes they only knew a slice of it, right? Or they were there for a moment in time, but to get that feedback is really helpful and really encouraging, because you want to make sure you capture it as best you can, and if it rings through the people who are there, that means a lot.
Absolutely. We do have a couple more questions, Craig. Was the total collapse of the Afghanistan government anticipated or a surprise, as it seemed there was hope for a gradual plan of U.S. withdrawal?
Yeah, that's a good question. And touched on that earlier. I guess it's both. So I think the best example of that was the summer of 2021. It was either June or July. President Biden was asked by reporters. He had announced the drawdown. He said we'd be out by September, or actually, I think at that point he said by August 31st. But already the Taliban was starting to make its move through some of the provincial capitals, and Biden was asked, do you think this could be another Saigon moment? And of course, the allusion was to the end of the US war in Vietnam in 1975, when helicopters were evacuating people off the roof of the US Embassy in Saigon, a very chaotic scene, and one that's forever seared in our nation's collective memory, I think. That really signified our defeat in Vietnam. And Biden was asked, could that happen in Afghanistan? And Biden was dismissive of it. He said, absolutely not. This isn't going to be another Vietnam. And at that time, the intelligence agencies were saying, as I mentioned before, that they anticipated that the Afghan government would be able to hold on for a few months once the last US troops left, that they knew it was only a matter of time till the Taliban took over, but they thought that the Afghan government would be able to hang on for a while. And that was the plan, that we would get our people out before the Taliban took over. Well, of course, just weeks after Biden dismissively says this would not be another Saigon, that's exactly what happened. I mean, people saw the video of our C-17s trying to lift off from Kabul airport with these crowds of Afghans running after it, and people trying to hang on to the airplane, and a few people falling off out of the sky. And I think that was, to me, it was just shocking. To this day, when I watch those videos, it's still just, it's very emotional seeing that. And so in some ways, it looked worse than Saigon, right? I mean, we had our troops there at the end valiantly trying to protect and evacuate, over 100,000 people. And it's incredible what they were able to accomplish in those last days. But the idea that I do think the Biden administration just didn't see that scenario coming until it was way too late. I saw recently General McKenzie, Frank McKenzie, who had been the CENTCOM commander during this time. He had recently given some interviews saying that he had flown into the Persian Gulf, into Doha, into Qatar on August 15th, and he was prepared to negotiate with the Taliban. They knew the Taliban was closing in, and they wanted to negotiate a way to say, okay, you guys stay out of Kabul and we'll evacuate, then you can take over. But events had already by the time General McKenzie landed in Doha, the Taliban had already taken over Kabul. They just swept through. So, even up to the very last hours, I think the Biden administration didn't foresee the chaotic disaster at the end. And again, I think this gets back to, they just lack this fundamental understanding of the country. They didn't see what was unfolding in front of their very eyes.
Well, Craig, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fantastic listening to you. Definitely eye-opening for sure. And to be even more open in the eyes, please go out and get a copy of this book, The Afghanistan Papers. It is fantastic from start to finish, and it really does give you a sense of why we weren't successful over there. I guess I'll just put it that way. But thank you again, Craig, for joining us today. And I'd like to thank all of our audience members out there for joining us as well. We always appreciate you joining us on a Monday afternoon for our book talks and our curator conversations. And we hope to see you at more of our events. You can always find them at wisvetsmuseum.com under the events tab. We have many more coming up throughout the rest of the year. So again, thank you everybody for joining us. And Craig, again, thank you so much, sir.